Okay, folks, we're looking at social Darwinism abroad. Some of the followers of Darwin applied his ideas in society, and it led to conclusions and attitudes that promoted or justified laissez-faire government, the trickle-down theory, that government should not regulate business nor help the poor. The poor are poor because they choose to be poor, or the poor are poor because they're genetically predispositioned to be poor, just like alcoholics and prostitutes and thieves are predispositioned. So that's going to bring rise to the eugenics movement. Simply prohibit those from involved in crime and vice from procreating, and eventually we'll do away with crime and vice. Well, those same types of ideas, social Darwinism in particular, will be used in U.S. dealings abroad. Look at this editorial cartoon. A couple things you need to see. First of all, there's Lady Liberty, Miss Columbia blowing the horn of peace. Yay! And Uncle Sam sitting in the back with his feet up and the traditional I am happy look on his face. So he's looking at the foreground. There's, like I said, Lady Liberty, Miss Columbia bringing peace to, well, look at those three women. One says the Philippines, one says Puerto Rico, one says Cuba on their dress. Notice the chains have been broken. Oh, probably by Miss Columbia or Lady Liberty. Look how they're dressed. Barefoot, rags, torn dresses. Look how dark their skin is. Look how dark their hair is. That all means something. Well, the United States was fearful of war, fearful of revolution, and now excited about war. Americans believe that of all the world revolutions, there was only one that was successful, and thus we're going to steer clear of revolutions. And war is okay if we initiate it, but we don't want to get involved in foreign conflicts and civil wars. Fearing, of course, that once we get involved, we'll be sucked in. That's what happens in Europe. For centuries, we saw Europe get involved in one foreign conquest after another, and it does not end well. Here's one idea on war. War is a biological necessity. War gives a biologically just decision. War is a universal law of nature. Frederick von Bernhardi, 1912. Google him. You'll be interested in what you see. Well, although Americans did not like the idea of revolution and did not want to get involved in foreign affairs, there was this belief that war was important for the development of young men. It was a rite of passage. We have all sorts of rites of passage today. Maybe your driver's license when you're 16, graduating from high school when you're 18, being able to drink when you're 21, all sorts of rites of passage. We have different rites for different ethnic groups and religious groups. Some people recognize you're an adult when you're 12, some 13, some 15, all sorts of rites of passages, politically, socially, religiously, which they, for the most part, did not have. So war was exceptionally important. And when war came to not an end, but then when there wasn't a lot of war, we went with Plan B, and Plan B was athletics, especially boxing and football. Look at the war metaphors in football. We don't see those war metaphors in baseball. Two very different cultural exchanges. Well, one aspect I would say we cannot ignore about American activities abroad was in 1890 the federal government announced that the West was closed. And Americans believed the significance of the West was there to send our excess population and try out new ideas and create new markets. So when Frederick Jackson Turner gave his very important speech at the Columbian Exposition in 1893, that got a lot of Americans thinking. We need a West. We need to find our new West. And with social Darwinism being applied, the idea is these people, these foreigners, need our intervention. They need our elevation. We are more advanced than them, so maybe it's natural that we should rule them. All sorts of different applications of social Darwinism abroad. Well, let's look at foreign policy. How do we traditionally examine foreign policy? And I would say foreign policy was a continuity, not a change. I mean, first of all, we did not get involved in foreign affairs. Not that often. You want to say the Mexican-American War was, yes and no. It wasn't intervening in Mexican affairs as it was intervening on the side of Texas in their border issue. We're not going to get involved in the Mexican Revolution. Yeah, at least not until Pancho Villa attacks Columbus, New Mexico. But we're not getting involved in the revolution. We're trying to arrest Pancho Villa. Well, how do we get places like Alaska and the Midway Islands and San Juan Islands and Pago Pago and Santo Domingo? We got them not the European way. The European way is by invading a country, whapping them over the heads and taking their land. We got this land through the American way, and the American way was writing big bad checks. We wrote checks to foreign powers to secure this land. After the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe, we actually wrote 3 checks to Mexico. One was for the land, the northern tier, basically from Texas to California. Second check was for the damage that the U.S. Army incurred in Mexico. And 3, it was for the Mexicans who were moving back to Mexico, the loss of land. So traditionally our foreign policy revolves around money. We write checks. So here's a photograph of the Glee Club aboard the USS Maine. The Glee Club was simply a choir. January 24th, 1898. Let's see how gleeful they are in a few minutes. They're pretty young, aren't they? And a lot of them look pretty young. There have been U.S. missionaries running around Hawaii and the South Pacific in general, since the 18th century. William Seward sought a reciprocity treaty, which became a fact by 1875. The reciprocity treaty between Hawaii and the U.S. Made Hawaiian sugar producers dependent on the U.S. market. The U.S. was buying as much as possible. Between 1876 and 1885, Hawaiian sugar production increased 7-fold, from $1.3 million to $8.4 million in profit. And the vast majority of the Hawaiian sugar growers, at least those that own the land, were Americans. And these Americans forced the Hawaiian royalty to adopt a constitutional government to protect the foreign, i.e. American control over sugar production and trade to the U.S. Well, the diseases that Americans brought over decimated the Hawaiian population, just like the diseases that the Europeans brought over decimated the Native American populations. So, we're going to bring in cheap labor from Asia, Chinese, Japanese particularly. Now, the planters and the missionaries, the American planters and American missionaries, used social Darwinism to civilize the islands. Eventually, in 1893, to depose the Queen, Liliuokalani, and seeking to make Hawaii an American territory. Well, these American planters and missionaries declared their independence and applied for annexation. And they used social Darwinism to justify what they did. Not just is it best for the surviving Hawaiian people, but it's best for the American economy. Teddy Roosevelt, he was concerned about what Frederick Jackson Turner said. Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy or Undersecretary. I forget the name of the title. He was the #2 guy in the Navy. And by the 1890s. He said the U.S., quote, needed a war. We've seen this before, an entire generation of American men growing up without that ability to go to war. War being essential in the eyes of Americans to grow up, to become a man. So that's why Teddy Roosevelt said we needed a war. Alfred T. Mahan in 1890 wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power, which explained why certain peoples, well, held empires, from the ancient Greeks to the, at that time, current English empire. So Teddy Roosevelt likes this, so as the number 2 guy in the Naval Department, he supports the appropriation from Congress to build the modern Navy, the Navy we have today. 11 new steel battleships, for example. But some people worry that if we build a large, modern, offensive Navy, then we'll use it. One reason why we had such a small Navy since the establishment of this country was the fear of getting involved in foreign entanglements. If we don't have a large Navy, if we don't have a Navy large enough to send our troops from here to there, we will not send our troops from here to there, and thus we will not get involved in foreign entanglements. Well, it was convenient at that time to apply natural selection on nations, and doing so gave a pseudo-scholarly theory to go abroad. We're going abroad not for our own interest, like the Europeans. We're going abroad to civilize, to Christianize, to Americanize, and to protect the U.S. economic interest abroad, which, of course, will lead to war. There had been near constant insurrection between the people of Cuba and the Spanish since Columbus showed up. And Americans, for the most part, did not get involved. Didn't get involved because we didn't have a lot to lose. Well, by 1890, Americans had invested about $50 million a year in Cuba. So now we're talking, we have an economic interest. Well, the Spanish government sends a man named Valeriano Weyler to Cuba to put down a rebellion in 1895. Americans called him the Butcher. The Cuban towns were turned into concentration camps. Rebels were tortured and put to death. And American newspaper publishers like Hearst and Pulitzer printed these sensational stories about the Butcher Weyler to boost circulation. They were not necessarily real stories. They were fictitious to, like I said, sell newspapers. Well, they put out so many editions of these silly newspapers that the paper was substandard. It turned yellow very quickly, so this type of publishing became known as the Yellow Press. Well, McKinley is elected president in November of 1896, and he campaigned on a couple things. One, to protect American businesses, and two, to free the Cuban people. So McKinley enters negotiations with Spain, and they break down in February of 1898. Well, a guy named Leon wrote a letter between Cuba and Spain, calling the president, quote, weak and a would-be politician. And although McKinley presses the government in Spain to fire this guy, American people are angered by this slight. So in 1898, McKinley sends the USS Maine to Havana just to remind the Spanish that we have an economic interest in Cuba. Well, on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine gets blown up. 260 American sailors are killed. And the Yellow Press calls for war against Spain. Remember the Maine was the motto of the day. Well, the U.S. government quickly concluded that, quote, Spanish terrorists blew up the Maine. in 1976, the Department of Navy will come to a conclusion that it wasn't Spanish terrorists, but it was a really, really, really bad design of the engine, the boiler, that caused the explosion. Anyhow, Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, orders Admiral Dewey to prepare for war in Asia, specifically the Philippines. That's in February of 1898. Roosevelt specifically tells Dewey to attack Spanish fleet in the Philippines if war breaks out between the U.S. and Spain. Well, McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war April 11, 1898. And although Spain agrees to all American demands, i.e. there's no reason to go to war, McKinley tells Congress that, quote, God has told him to attack the Spanish forces. Whoa! So we're not doing this for economic reasons. We're doing this because God wants us to do this. What do you know? A politician acting because God told him to do so. We certainly don't see that today, do we? Look at politicians who are running for, or have ran for president, or have been elected president. It's not unusual since the end of World War II for these politicians to claim they are running for elected office because God wants them to be that. Or when they get elected, especially president, God wanted them to be elected. Certainly, President George W. Bush said that loud and frequently when he was given the presidency by the Supreme Court in a vote of 5-4, until his handler said he should stop saying that. So it's not unusual for politicians to declare they are acting upon God's will. So April 11th, we declare war on Spain. May 1st, Admiral Dewey, in about 45 minutes, sends the Spanish fleet to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Well, that may have been too short. It may have been a few hours. Well, Congress passes the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment stated that we are not going to war for our own means, support our own interests. We are going to war to help the Cuban people. And specifically, it was a non-annexation amendment. We're going there to free them, and we'll probably hang around long enough to civilize them, but then we're going to leave. We're not going to be around. Well, there were about 200,000 Spanish troops in Cuba and only 26,000 American troops on active duty throughout the whole country, but this is a popular war, and war doesn't happen that often, and war is needed as a way for young boys to become men. And so American men are climbing over each other to enlist. Teddy Roosevelt quits his position for the federal government and, well, tries to enlist, but he can't because he's too old, so he does what a lot of guys do, a lot of wealthy older guys, is that, well, he doesn't create his own military unit. He joins a group in San Antonio called the Rough Riders, and because he's Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders decide to put him in charge of their military unit. Here's a photograph from a play put on in the United States to try to get American people to sympathize. That's Uncle Sam with the weapon. That's Lady Liberty, Miss Columbia in the middle. And look at that, little baby Cuba. Oh, what do we do with babies? Well, we teach them and we raise them, we take care of them, we nurture them, we feed them, we give them little hugs. That's what we're doing to Cuba. We're going to treat them like little infants. Oh, look at this editorial cartoon, The Spanish Brute. Maine sailors murdered by Spain. Dun dun dun, like I said, 1976, so we're going to reverse that position. Look at the blood dripping from this knife. Look at the... Look at this. This is not human, is it? There's not nails on this creature's hand or claws. Not teeth so much as fangs. The skull is back, the jaw juts out. There's some certainly animal aspects to this, and psychologically that's going to be really important. Luckily, most of us don't have a natural appetite toward killing each other. Most of us have to be persuaded to do so, and One traditional way of persuading Americans or anybody to attack and kill other people is to promote the idea that other people are less human than us, are subhuman. And that's what we're doing here with the Spanish. And although the Teller Amendment said we are going to free the Cuban people, our focus is squarely like a laser in the Philippines, and here's why. We need the Philippines to get to China. China has been and continues to be the #1 trading goal. There's 1 billion people over there. If we can start selling stuff, we'll make a lot of money. We look the other way of China's human rights abuses today. There's no religious freedom. There's no political freedom. There's no social freedom. There's no freedoms at all as Americans describe freedoms. Yet we're going to trade billions of dollars with the Chinese. We look the other way because money is more important than values. That is today. That was 100 years ago. That was 200 years ago. Well, in the 1890s, we did not have the technology to send a steamer off the coast of San Francisco and making it all the way to China. We needed not 1 but 2 stops. First stop for recoaling is going to be Hawaii. The second stop for recoaling, for filling up the ships full of fuel or coal or whatever they use, is going to be the Philippines. So the Philippines are an intimate part of our trade goal with the Chinese. And yes, the American soldiers are using Philippines as human shields in this photograph. Well, then there was the anti-imperialist league. And the concern was simple. If we go to Cuba, if we go to the Philippines, and their people are inherently different than us, I mean, they're Catholic. Don't we have enough Catholics already, was the concern? If we annex these countries, then these people can come here unabated by any sort of immigration law or treaty. And we have enough non-white, non-Protestant people living here. There was also higher reasons for anti-imperialism. Look at this. Is he to be a despot with Napoleon and Caesar looking down on McKinley? Well, look how the Filipino people are portrayed in the editorial cartoon as stereotypical Africans. Look at the one on the right. Liberty Holt's American Butchery in the Philippines. Look at the wild look in Uncle Sam's face. So was the U.S. imperialistic? Well, it depends on your definition of imperialism. If we're looking at the European definition, no, we're not. The European definition was to go to a foreign country, whap them over the head, take their land, and then transfer English or European people to that foreign country, and then take a percentage of the population of the foreign country and bring it back to the European country and teach them and train them to be leaders. England, for example, and India. England gets India from the French as a result of the 7 Years' War, which comes to an end in 1763, 1764. And so what England does is it takes the English population and moves some of it to India to be the temporary leaders, while it takes some of the Indian population and sends them to places like Oxford to become, well, classically educated in English laws, English customs, English traditions, Anglicanism, a parliamentary style of government, and then sent back to India to rule their people. So we didn't actually do that. We came close to whapping people over the head, Spain, and taking their land, Cuba and the Philippines, but not quite, and I'll tell you why not. Well, we had a problem in the Philippines. Like I said, the Dewey sends the Spanish fleet down to the bottom of the ocean. I think it was like maybe 7 hours. The battle was pretty quick, and so Americans actually thought that we were going to be greeted as heroes. The people of the Philippines would wave American flags and give us hugs and kisses. We would be viewed as, quote, liberators. Vice President Dick Cheney publicly said the same thing. In in preparation for the U.S. ramping up to invade Iraq. The Iraqi people will see us as liberators. It didn't quite happen that way in Iraq. It did not quite happen that way in the Philippines. Well, before we went into the Philippines, we picked a guy who we believe we could trust to be the next Filipino leader, a guy named Aguinaldo, a guy who for the most part didn't even live in the Philippines. He was exiled in China. Anyhow, we dress him up in a good-looking American military officer's outfit, and we bring him into Manila Bay, and we say, yay, you're in charge of the country. We would like to let you know what we want you to do. And Aguinaldo says, no, I'm not going to trade one master for another. We're not going to get rid of the Spanish just to have the Americans tell us what to do. So now we have a new war. Now it's the U.S. military against the Filipino people. So the Filipino people did not see us as liberators. They saw us as the new masters. And now we have the U.S.-Filipino War, which will last about 6 or 7 years. Look at that photograph of Aguinaldo on the left and the editorial cartoon of Aguinaldo and Uncle Sam on the right. First of all, it's the feminization of Uncle Sam, i.e. the U.S. military, U.S. foreign policy. And there's Aguinaldo, who they have them dressed in a very stereotypical, cartoonish, certainly racist according to our standards, not racist according to their standards, African. Fighting in the Philippines is very much like we're going to have fighting in World War I. It's trench warfare. It was also different in the sense that it's going to remind us, or it's going to be the same as fighting in Vietnam. Filipino people don't. The Filipino army don't have uniforms. They're primarily guerrilla units. There's a lot of hand-to-hand combat. There's a lot of urban combat. Like, we're just not used to that. We're used to lining people up and marching across open areas and blasting them. We did that during the American Civil War. We're going to do that in World War II, and that's how we're going to prepare for the next war with the godless communists following World War II. So the Filipino War was different in the sense that it's going to be the wave of the future, like I said, especially when we get to Vietnam. Well, it's going to cost the U.S. about $600 million to end the Filipino War. You know how much it cost us to fight the Spanish-American War? $250 million. And about 200,000 Filipinos will be killed. So how do we end this? Well, we have the Teller Amendment, which says we are not going to annex. We are going to go in there. We're going to civilize. We're going to educate. We're going to democratize. And then as soon as we're done with our mission, we are going to leave. Well, here's a editorial cartoon, the cover of a magazine called The Judge, on what McKinley's going to do. He is bathing the Filipinos in civilization. He is baptizing them. And Filipinos don't want to go. Look at that little Filipino baby. He is unhappy. Look at the Cubans in the back. See, it worked out for them, so it's going to work out for the Filipino people. Well, the Teller Amendment says, once again, we're not going to annex. The Platt Amendment says this. 1, the U.S. will be in charge of treaties. Cuba and the Philippines cannot make any treaties unless we allow it. 2, intervention. The U.S. has the right to intervene in Cuban and Filipino affairs as we see fit, and thus we need a little part of each island to create a military base. Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and Subic Bay in the Philippines. So, Teller Amendment says we're not going to annex these territories. The Platt Amendment, well, it doesn't say we're going to annex them, but we're certainly going to control them. There was the Anti-Imperialistic League. Again, they are concerned that if we stay long enough, we will eventually, well, let's say we don't even annex Cuba and the Philippines, but we stay there long enough that we bring American civilization, American democracy, American capitalism, Protestantism to these people, and eventually we're going to want to annex them. And although they may be civilized, they're not quite white enough to be considered white people, thus equals in American societies, as the nativists see them. Well, the United States is not just going to seize this land from Spain. We're going to pay. We'll write a check for $20 million for the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam. Now, the Anti-Imperialistic League opposed this Treaty of Paris, the thing that ends the war between the U.S. and Spain, fearing, once again, that the Cubans, the Spanish, the Filipinos, the Puerto Ricans, the people in Guam will eventually migrate to the United States. And there's a vote about granting the Filipino people their independence. And it does not pass. It does not pass by one vote. It's actually a split vote, and in that case, the Vice President casts the deciding vote. And Teddy Roosevelt was Vice President. He cast against granting independence to the Philippines. He believes that our civilizing mission had not come to an end. Here's an editorial cartoon about anti-imperialist sentiment. There's the Native American speaking to the Filipino, once again demonstrating that the Filipinos are nothing but Africans. And the caption is speaking from experience, i.e. it didn't end well for the Native Americans, it's probably not going to end well for the Filipinos. Well, one of the driving ideas at this time was called white man's burden. One of those Englishmen who went to India to help civilize was a guy named Kipling. And Kipling wrote a series of books, children's books primarily. They were about, they were set in India. The Jungle Book is going to be one of his most popular children's books, but he's also going to write, poems and essays. And one of the poems he writes is called White Man's Burden. In a nutshell, he says, it's painful, it's messy, it's expensive, and sometimes people die, but because England is so highly evolved, England has a God-given duty to run around the world bringing civilization. That is the burden of white society. White society is more highly evolved than any other types of societies, and so we have this God-ordained mission to do so. So, Kipling says that's why we're in India. That's why England is running around the world, because that's the burden of white men. And we got Sumner saying, no, we should not do that, that people are backwards because they're backwards. There's nothing we can do about it. We cannot elevate societies. And then you have the Boer War. The Boer War was in Africa. It was the English against some African folks, and at the same time as the U.S.-Filipino War, the Philippine insurrection, as we call it. Well, every day in the newspaper, we're reading about English deaths. And it doesn't end. It just continues and goes on and on and on and on. And Americans start wondering, is that our future? Are we just going to be fighting the Filipinos forever? Sending American boys home in wooden